What is it that calls you here, that calls you onward, that calls you inward, that leads you homeward? What is it that gives you the power to make that change, to ask that question, to take that journey? What is it that says you have done well, that asks you to learn more, that brings you to stillness, that holds you up in hard times? It is relationship, that beating heart of our faith. It begins when we share this hour, our truths, this air, our hearts. Friends, let us worship together. Our opening hymn this morning is number 57, All Beautiful, the March of Days. Now I invite forward David Temple for the morning's poem.
The Summer Day. This is a good one by Mary Oliver, like most of hers. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean. The one who has flung herself out of the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who's gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I've been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everyone die at last, and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?
Thank you, David. So I'm wondering, how many of you made some New Year's resolutions? Anyone? I'm not going to embarrass you by having you tell the rest of us what they are, but let me guess. I assume that some of you are resolved to take better care of your bodies, maybe lose some weight, or do better at exercising regularly, or maybe you're going to quit ordering a donut when you stop for that cup of coffee. Or you're going to change other kinds of behaviors. Maybe you're going to stop all of that impulsive buying and learn to live within your budget. Or you're going to cut back on the hours at the office and spend more time with your families. Or you're going to quit surfing the net as much as you've been and interface more with the actual people in your house. Or you've resolved to quit being so judgmental or short-tempered. Maybe you're going to stop procrastinating. Now, I might have missed your New Year's resolution completely, but in my experience, our New Year's resolutions usually have something to do with personal improvement. That somehow we're going to be better this year than we were last year. That things will be different in the year stretching ahead of us. That we really will have learned from some of our past mistakes. You know, the passing of another year reminds us of how quickly life passes, of how fragile our hold on it really is. You know, this knowledge, it could lead to fear, desperation, despair. You know, but on the other hand, this knowledge could lead us toward a deeper appreciation of just how precious this life of ours really is, and to ponder the questions asked by Mary Oliver. She says, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" Well, it seems appropriate that we ponder this question on a day when a whole new year stretches out before us, when we wonder not only how this coming year might be different to us, but how we might be different to it. A few years ago, there was something going around called an autobiography in 5 short chapters. It was written by Portia Nelson, and it goes like this. Chapter 1, I walk down the street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I am lost. I am helpless. It isn't my fault. It takes me forever to find a way to get out. Chapter 2, I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in. Again. I can't believe I'm in the same place, but it isn't my fault. It still takes a very long time to get out. Chapter 3, I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it is there. I still fall in because it's a habit, but my eyes are open. I know where I am. It is my fault. I get out immediately. Chapter 4, I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. Chapter 5, I walk down another street. You know, as we enter this new year, the question is not how this coming year is going to be different for you. The question is, how are you going to be different to it? The reality is that life will continue to unfold as it will. There will be lots and lots of sidewalks to walk down, lots of choices. And some of those sidewalks are going to have deep holes in them. Are you going to continue to fall in? Will you get better at climbing out? Will you take responsibility when you do fall in? Will you be able to forgive yourself for doing so? Will you pick yourself up and start all over again? Will you have the courage to start a new chapter? Or are you going to remain stuck in the old one? This is what happens to a lot of us. We get stuck somehow, stuck in the present. Or even more common, I think, is that we get stuck in the past. Peter Fleck was a Dutch investment banker who watched as Hitler's armies spread across Europe. He was able to flee his homeland and ended up here in New England, where he became a devoted Unitarian Universalist and a well-known lay preacher and writer. At the ripe old age of 75, Peter had the honor of being ordained a minister by the UU Church in Brewster. And the last book of his that was published, it was entitled Come As You Are. He writes, I wish I could leave history alone. Or rather, I wish that history could leave me alone. I mean, my personal history. The things that have happened to me and the things that have not happened to me. The things I've done and the things I've left undone. I wish I could make my peace with all of these things. But I can't. Sometimes I lay awake at night wishing I had done what I have not done. Wishing I had left undone what I have done. And I realized that I missed opportunities for happiness because I didn't know that they existed. Had I known, well, then I would have seized them. I realized that I often neglected to experience life at any given moment by itself and for itself, and not as a stepping stone to something else. He writes, this is not to say that I have not known happiness. I've known great happiness, but I have too often not savored that happiness in the moment when it occurred. Too often I have experienced my happiness only looking backward. I realize now that at that time I was happy, or by looking forward, in anticipation of this or that I'm happy, rather than savoring the happiness when it occurred, consciously, knowingly, unconditionally, existentially, without implications and without consequences. Peter talks about some of the ways in which he was stuck in the past and how he attempted to make peace with his past, attempted to deal with all the ways in which he was his own worst enemy and all those others in his life, like his parents, who closed doors that should have remained open, who opened doors that should have remained closed, who asked questions that should have remained unasked, who had no time when he needed their time. He says that his parents had good intentions. They were basically good people. But he says, I still have sleepless nights trying to figure it all out, trying to make things fit, trying to reinterpret past events in an effort to make them more acceptable, to get rid of some of the embarrassments, some of the feelings of inadequacy and failure they instilled in me, as well as all of those feelings of guilt I can only get rid of by forgiving myself. Peter was in his 80s when he wrote this, a thoughtful man, a wise man who says, it's as if I have spent my life making pieces of a huge puzzle. How amazing and how gratifying that the pieces fit together, and that in this still unfinished puzzle I can discern the pattern of my life. But in trying to complete the puzzle, I find that certain pieces are missing, and others seem to have no place, and it is very late in the day. I have no time to create the missing pieces, no time to restructure the puzzle in order to create room for the spare pieces. The whole thing doesn't add up, at least not with a high degree of perfection, which in my book would mean that all of the pieces fit together, leaving no holes and no extras. You suppose that this is what we are to be doing? Fitting the pieces of the puzzle together? reshaping them so that they fit perfectly, making sure that there are no missing pieces? Are we writing a story as each year unfolds, writing our autobiography chapter by chapter? Now, someone once said that the problem with thinking of our lives as a story is that the story never ends. We might see some patterns, we might finish a chapter, but we don't know how the whole story ends. It just keeps going on and on. How can we make sense of something when we don't know how it will end? How can we see the whole picture when there are still so many pieces missing? Peter Fleck was not satisfied with all of those missing pieces, with all of the holes in the puzzle of his life. But then he goes on to say, "But God does not seem to share my idea of perfection. And I begin to think that maybe there are meant to be holes and spare pieces, holes through which God's breath can flow, spare pieces that suggest alternative arrangements of the puzzle. So these days, I say to myself that what fits, fits. What does not fit is meant to stimulate me to greater creativity." Lewis Smedes, in his book, A Pretty Good Person, describes the raw material of life like this. He says, "I remember the Friday afternoon when my wife and I walked into Bethany home and met Kathy for the first time. She was bawling like an amplified saxophone, her eyes shut against a world of strangers, her face puffed like a miniature Alfred Hitchcock. We picked her up, plunked her down into our game, and dealt her a hand she had never a chance to refuse. We decided who her brothers and friends would be, where she would live, what sort of school she would go to, what God she would be taught to worship, and who would surround her every waking moment with their loving, nagging, angry, confusing, caring, careless, stupid, and wise parental devotion. She had no options. And before we came along, somebody else had provided her with a genetic legacy. Two people came together in a moment of passion and then and there bankrolled or handicapped her with a genetic blueprint of her future. Same thing happens to us all. Some of us inherit a genetic fortune, and others begin with a budget deficit. Either way, we take what we get. You know, the first step in owning our own stories is coming to terms with the raw material that we've been given. I often wonder, why was I born into the family I was born into? How might things have turned out differently if I was born in a different place, at a different time? No, but as the years have unfolded, it's been the totality of the raw material I was handed that I've needed to face and attempt to understand and make some peace with. And what I've learned is that the more I've been able to do this, the less that this old stuff from my past has control over my life. I don't fall into nearly as many holes as I used to. It gets easier to spot them when I'm not groping blindly about. When I spot these holes, sometimes I'm able to walk around them. Now, don't get me wrong, I still fall in once in a while, but it sure become easier over the years to get out. Personally, I stopped making New Year's resolutions quite a few years ago. I guess it was when I realized that it wasn't good enough to resolve to do better only at the beginning of each year. This was something I needed to do with more regularity, always trying to understand what's going on and how the pieces would more easily fit together, and how I can be a bit more intentional about the ways I respond to what each day brings. It's been so important to me that I embrace life as fully as I can. It seems so important to be able to acknowledge our own stories, the pieces and the way those pieces fit together. Lewis Smedes tells the story of a man named John who lived most of his life in garbage. He writes, "It began with his father, Theodore, who, as a recent immigrant, got a job as a helping hand on a garbage truck. His boss dropped dead at the dump one day, so Theodore bought the truck from his widow. Until the day he died, he earned a decent living by carting garbage from uptown restaurants to the landfills on the edge of town. As soon as his shoulders were big enough, John helped his father heave the garbage from the cans to the truck and then off again. It didn't take John long to figure out that there was more money to be made if he could get his hands on more than one truck. If someday he could buy his own trucks, hire drivers, and keep several of them going on at the same time. Before he was 30, he managed to get 4 trucks on the road and figured he was on his way to big things in garbage. But 3 bad things happened to him along the way to the top of the heap. First came a meeting with the mob. They told John that nobody could haul garbage in that city without paying for protection. But John said he figured on being an exception to the rule. A week later, somebody stole one of his trucks, loaded it to the hilt with fresh manure, backed it into his garage, and blew it up with dynamite. This persuaded John that paying tribute was a necessary evil in garbage hauling. The second bad thing that happened was the Vietnam War. His son Ted was drafted, but he had moral feelings about not going. He wanted to be a conscientious objector and run away to Canada. John believed that when a young man's country calls him to fight a war, a person has to go, whether it's his choice or not. Anybody who ran away was no son of his. Ted was shamed into the draft and then went to Vietnam. He was there for a couple of months when a squadron of American fighter planes accidentally strafed his platoon, and Ted died by a military mistake. The third bad thing happened to his wife, Lainey. Lainey's left leg suddenly wouldn't do what she told it to do. And 2 years after Ted got killed in the war, Lainey was told she had multiple sclerosis. She needed a lot of care. And it changed John's life. Garbage began to stink. He felt like a coward for doing business with crooks. The war turned bad, and Ted's dying lost its point. He stayed in the business because he was 50 and didn't know how to do anything else. But he sold off 4 of his 5 trucks. He kept only one, drove it himself, finished the run by noon, and dedicated his afternoons and evenings to Lainey. John is in his 70s now. Lainey is gone. He mostly pokes around in his Sears cords and rag wool sweater, cooking meals, cleaning the house, and keeping his Buick tip-top. You got him to talking about the story he wrote, you would get a stream of thought that goes something like this. How do I feel about the life that I've lived? I'm not complaining. Not ashamed either. Getting rid of garbage is important. People don't think about that until it piles up. I wish to God I hadn't paid off those crooks, but I did it, so what can I do now? I wish to God I'd never talked Ted into going into that war. It seemed right to me then. And given who I was and how I felt about this country, I'd probably do it again. But I'm really sorry that I did. What I believe is this: my life is one little stitch in the sleeve of God's big pattern. Lainey always said that I did pretty good with what he gave me to work with. And she did a lot to get me to believe that God forgave me for all of my foul-ups. I'm grateful for that, and I'm settling for what I've had and what I've done. Garbage man who owns the story he's been writing. All the raw material he'd been given. All the foul-ups. All the holes that life ditched out to him. acceptance, forgiveness. He did pretty good considering everything, and he's grateful. There's another year stretching out in front of you. What are you planning to do with this one wild and precious life that you've been given? When Pablo Casals was 90 years old, the greatest of all cellists, he kept practicing the cello for 4 to 5 hours each day. Someone asked him why. Why, at his age, he worked so hard at the fundamentals of his art? Because, he said, I think I'm making some progress. Well, according to Professor Smedes, life is really all about making some progress at being what we are meant to be. The way being a bud is about becoming a blossom, or being a well-born colt is about becoming a thoroughbred racer. We have an inner itch to be more of what we were meant to be. And we never know, but that we are on the verge of a breakthrough. And so, may you become more of what you were meant to be as the coming year unfolds. May you know that the story enveloping your life is your story in all its fullness. May acceptance be part of your journey, and forgiveness as well. May the pieces of the puzzle that are you fit together just a little bit better. May the pattern of your life reveal itself in all its disarray and in all of its beauty. And may you be filled with gratitude. So may it be.